A teenager that never made it to her flight. A busy mother of two that vanished without a trace. And a beloved elderly farmer with a mortal enemy. These are three of the most disturbing disappearances from this year so far. So, let's dive in. She vanished without warning. For weeks, her friends and family begged for answers, and when her body was finally discovered, well, it wasn't the strangers who stood accused. This is the very chilling case of 17-year-old Pheobe Bishop. Phoebe, who was living in a very quiet part town of Nambour in Queensland, was just after moving out of her mother's house, and she was now living with a few of housemates in a very cramped space in a house in Gin. But Phoebe was very optimistic about her future. This was the first step in becoming an independent adult. And so she thought that whatever life would throw at her, she would be able to deal with it. And while her living situation, wasn't the best, Phoebe did have something to look forward to. Not so long ago, she agreed on flying over to see her boyfriend in Perth, and her trip was actually approaching very soon. And so on the morning of 15th of May 2025, Phoebe hopped into the Hyundai SUV her flatmate owned, and soon enough, herself and her two housemates, James Wood and Tanika Bromley, were on their way to the airport. Later on that day, Phoebe's boyfriend was waiting at the arrival gate in Perth, and he was getting visibly nervous. You see, the flight Phoebe was actually on touched down some time ago, but his girlfriend was still not coming through. Now, the pair did try to have a call that morning before the flight, but there must have been some sort of a connection issue, because Phoebe's boyfriend could not hear her at all. And now, hours and several planes later, Phoebe's boyfriend decided that enough was enough and that he went to contact the police and report her as missing. But when the police arrived, they found their very first chilling clue. Phoebe actually never made it to the flight. Now, for nearly 2 months, searches swept through the bushland. Posters went up, vigils were held, and rumors began to spread about what really could have happened to her. Now, Phoebe's mom, whose name is Kylie Johnson, gave multiple interviews and insisted that her daughter's disappearance was extremely out of character. Even Phoebe's flatmates, James and Tanika, were also brought in. Now, the couple were likely the last ones to see the teenager, but they didn't really have anything much to say because after dropping her off at the airport, they drove off and Phoebe has not been in touch with them ever since. But seeing she was still missing, the couple quickly joined the rescue efforts, and they printed lots of missing persons flyers, and James even offered his fishing boat, as a reward to anyone who comes forward with information about Phoebe. Now, sometime into the search, something very strange happened. A middle-aged couple who also joined the search efforts happened to come upon something they thought to be a very disturbing discovery. When they were searching the bushland, they came by a lake with something visibly poking out of the water. And when the couple went closer to it, they at first thought that they had found Phoebe. At first they started panicking because they didn't really want to be the first people, to be reporting this. And they didn't want to be the ones that would make the call to say that Phoebe has been found deceased. But then they stopped for a moment to, have a proper look at the thing that was in the water. And they let out a huge sigh of relief. It was not a human body. It was actually a mutilated mannequin that must have been just dumped and discarded into the lake, and it was now rotting on the bank of it. Now, while this discovery was indeed a huge relief, Phoebe's mom Kylie, in a very moving video, admitted that she was getting used to the idea of not finding her daughter alive. At that point, she just wanted to get to the bottom of what had really happened to her daughter, because not knowing clearly would have been the worst outcome. At the same time, the internet began circulating rumors that Phoebe never wanted to return home because she actually hated living under the same roof with her mom, hence she moved out and was living now with James and Tanika. Allegedly, Phoebe had a very hard time, growing up with being moved from house to house and having several stepdads come and go. Basically, a lot of people began pointing their fingers at Kylie, not really knowing the full extent of the story, or, fabricating information just so that the case would finally start to make sense. But then came June 2025, and everything everybody thought they knew about the case changed. On June 4th and 5th, 2 arrests were made, and the search, which was currently being conducted in the Goodnight Scrub National Park, was suspended. Now, this was just 5 days after it had begun, and so everyone began fearing the worst, that Phoebe would not really come home. On June 6th, in the same park, the remains of a young woman were found. And after running the DNA test, it would be confirmed that they indeed belonged to the missing woman, Phoebe. But it would turn out that Phoebe's killers were not just some random people she might have met while, traveling to Perth. No, her actual killers were nobody else but her housemates, James Wood and Tanika Bromley. While we do not have a full account of what had really happened on the day Phoebe vanished, it is suspected that the trio must have had an argument on the way to the airport. And in fact, earlier into the investigation, James and Tanika tried changing their story by saying that Phoebe was actually kicked out of the car because of an argument that happened between them three. Now, the car was spotted by CCTV 2 hours after the flight was scheduled in the nearby area, which really started to raise a lot of questions. Phoebe was also never spotted by any cameras at all at the airport, and the phone and luggage had never been found. Instead, the police searched the house in Gingin, and they found it to be extremely filthy and cramped, with neighbors complaining about the smell and noise, and that they would even recover 11 dead dogs in the backyard. After this, it was revealed that the couple had criminal charges associated with holding illegal weapons, and that Tanika herself developed a very strange liking for short firearms. But what probably shocked everyone the most was the fact that Tanika used to be really good friends with Phoebe's mom, Kylie. In fact, Kylie and Tanika used to work together, but then Tanika was let go, and some could speculate that Tanika began holding this really stern grudge. Both James and Tanika were charged with the murder and interfering with corpse. Phoebe's body was found very near the area that had been originally searched, which was about an hour's drive from the airport as well as the house in Gingin, and so it is believed that she had been moved at least twice. But then a third arrest was made later in July, and that was of a man named Kieran Misleheiser, who was in charge with 2 counts of accessory. Now, since the case was still with court in August, we still have no solid information as to, why Phoebe was caught. Was it a spur of moment, a tragic ending to a fight that went horribly wrong? Or was this a pre-planned murder that couple had been planning for months? And what was actually Kieran's association with that? I do hope that Phoebe's family can get the answers, they really deserve, and that her killers rot behind bars. But before we go into the next story, how about you come and join the community? We're still growing after all, and so it'd be really awesome to have you. Not only is this case of Delphine Jubillar strange, but it is also quite controversial. And that's because the trial that is just after starting in France, well, it's missing a very crucial piece of evidence that nobody has been able to recover yet. On a cold December night in 2020, Delphine vanished from her home in a small village of Cagnes-les-Mines in southern France. Now, she was this 33-year-old nurse, a wife, and a mother of 2 young children. So really a woman, trying to navigate the extremely difficult balance of family, career, and personal happiness. When her husband Cedric reported her missing, police at first treated it as a simple disappearance. Maybe she had just walked out after an argument. Maybe she needed some space. Maybe she had gone to stay with one of her friends or her family. But soon after that, it became very clear that something far more troubling had actually taken place. Now, inside of the house, Delphine's glasses were found on the table. Her pajamas were folded neatly on the chair. And there was no sign of struggle, there were no broken windows, and there was no forced entry. It was really as if she just had simply stepped out of the house and vanished into the thin air. Now, naturally, searches began immediately. Helicopters were circling overhead, police dogs were scouring the fields and woodlands, and even a team of divers were deployed to check nearby wells and rivers. And then even the neighbors joined in. But even with all these efforts, the searchers turned up just nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, just no trace. And so, slowly but surely, Weeks turned into months, and with no evidence of voluntary disappearance, investigators began to look closer at her personal life. And that's exactly where they discovered their first real clue. It would turn out that life at home for Delphine was not as simple and as peaceful as everyone believed it to be. She had actually been planning to leave her husband and start a new life with her new lover. In addition to this, Delphine had told her friends about how unhappy she was. She was telling them about all of those arguments that she was having with her husband that had grown more and more heated, and not really knowing what else to do. She had even begun speaking with this other man online, and slowly but surely she started planning her life after the divorce. And it's exactly these details that start to paint a much darker picture. By mid-2021, suspicion clearly turned towards the husband, Cedric. Not only did he have a very clear motive for killing his wife, but the investigators also added that his timeline didn't really add up. And they also noted his inconsistent behavior, after his wife's disappearance. And there was also this report of neighbors hearing shouting and screams of the night of the disappearance. And when the police arrived at the house after Cedric had called them, to report his wife missing, they had actually managed to seize a duvet from the washing machine, thinking it could bear vital evidence or DNA. And so with all of this in mind, in June of 2021, Cedric was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. But here is exactly where the case becomes more complex. All of this happened even with the fact that Delphine's body had never been found. There was also no murder weapon, no clear crime scene, nothing really tangible tying Cedric directly to the killing. It's just all based on circumstantial evidence, suspicion, and silence. Now, for years, the case stalled in limbo. Cedric remained in custody, denying any involvement, insisting his wife had simply left, and that he had nothing to do with it. And then new evidence emerged showing Cedric actually also using the dating website, meaning that it was just not Delphine who was looking for other options out there. But meanwhile, Delphine's family had been living in torment. They had no answers, they had no closure, no grave to visit. But then September 2025 came, so nearly 5 years after her disappearance, and the case went finally to trial. The courtroom in Toulouse became the stage for a haunting confrontation. Prosecutors clearly laid out their theory that Cedric, enraged by Delphine's decision to leave him, snapped during the night of December 15, 2020, and killed her inside of their home. They then argued that he just disposed of her somewhere and she just hasn't been found. And they also leaned heavily on motive, testimony from friends about her plans, and the volatile state of their marriage. But then the defense took a stand and countered with a very important reminder that there was no body. They argued that the prosecution's case is built purely on speculation, assumptions, and fragments of circumstantial evidence. Without physical proof, without even knowing how she died, how could jury convict a man of a murder? Now, the trial, which is still ongoing and is set to finish around 17th of October 2025, has been described as a battle of shadows. Every detail is contested. Every absence becomes an argument, like the pajamas left behind, the glasses on the table, or the silence over phone. To some, these are signs of sudden violent act inside of the home. But to others, they are meaningless coincidences, circumstantial and open to interpretation. But what really makes this case especially haunting is precisely what is missing. Most murder trials present, hard evidence. A body, weapon, bloodstains, fingerprints, DNA, you name it. But in this case of Delphine, none of that exists. Now, of course, it's not like there were never any attempts to find the evidence. Of course, there were plenty, even a recap of it all in 2025. But the investigators never really got anywhere. They looked into her car, a Peugeot 207, which did show signs of condensation, meaning that she could have actually spent the night there. But that was about it. There were also no traces of incriminating DNA found in there. They had even tested the washing machine and the duvet they had seized, but again, no blood was found there. As now, in late 2025, the outcome of his trial is still remaining uncertain. The family is of course hoping that Delphine will be found one day, But equally Cedric, if he really is innocent, this could provide him with a way out, giving him a new chance at a new life. But either way, Delphine's story has become one of the most haunting cases in recent French memory. And that's not because only of the suspected crime, but also because of the absence, the silence, and the mystery that surrounds it. I really hope that she will be found one way or another, and that this case can be put to rest, at least for her family's sake. On the morning of March 20th, 2025, 72-year-old farmer Michael Gaine left his home in rural County Kerry, Ireland. And he wasn't really heading far, he was just going to the nearby shop to top up his mobile credit. It was a simple routine errand, the kind of everyday task that never really make the news. But that was the last time Michael was seen alive. When he failed to return home, the alarm spread really quickly. Michael wasn't really a man who wandered far. He also suffered a recent leg injury, and so he couldn't really cover much ground, and he was only walking with real difficulty. And so his absence didn't really make much sense. Family and neighbors quickly reported him missing, and what began as a local concern soon escalated into one of Ireland's most haunting mysteries of 2025. Police and volunteers launched these large-scale searches across the Kerry countryside. The farmland that Michael was living on was combed inch by inch. Search teams brought in drones, dogs, and even specialists to examine slurry tanks. A grim but necessary step given the dangers and tragedies sometimes tied to farms. Helicopters swept the skies, divers checked the waterways. Yet despite the intensity of the search, there was never any sign of Michael. For days, speculations mounted. How could an elderly man with a limited mobility simply vanish from his own land? Now, some feared that he had been the victim of a robbery or maybe a violent attack. And then others wondered if he had just fallen into maybe like a hidden terrain, like a ditch or a bog or water tank, and simply had gone unnoticed. But after this, weeks passed. No trace, no clothing, no phone, nothing. Then in September 2025, the search took a very grim and unexpected turn. During a renewed sweep of Michael's farm, somewhere where they had already searched, investigators discovered partial human remains. And soon after that, the forensics testing confirmed what everyone had been fearing. The remains did belong to Michael Gaine. But instead of providing answers, the discovery really only raised more questions. How could his body have gone undiscovered for months and months on his own land, despite the exhaustive searches? Why were only partial remains found? And most importantly, what really happened to him? Police did quickly reclassify the case, suggesting it was no longer a simple missing persons report. The possibility of foul play could no longer be ruled out. But here's the thing, the investigators have not released the cause of his death. And with only really partial remains, we may actually never really know what happened to him. For the Gaine family, the discovery was absolutely devastating. They had spent months in limbo, torn between hope and dread, only to be then faced with the confirmation of Michael's death. But here's the thing, it was without a clarity of how or why it happened. And so the case has also left locals unsettled. Kerry is known for its close-knit communities and rugged landscapes, not for sinister mysteries. And for someone like Michael, an elderly farmer, well-known and well-liked in the area, to vanish in such a baffling way only to be found months later on his own farm, deceased, is very deeply disturbing. There are eerie details that keep fueling speculations. Why didn't the dogs find his remains during the initial searches? Did someone then move his body? Could he have been killed elsewhere and then just returned to the farm? Or is there a natural but still tragic explanation? Maybe a fall, an accident, exposure that left him undiscovered in a hidden corner of the land? As of late 2025, investigators remain silent. They continue to interview neighbors, family, and anyone who may have information or have seen Michael on the day of the disappearance. But no arrests have ever been made, and the community is left with whispers instead of answers. You know, there was one particular man thought to be connected to the case, but it has been just a speculation, so I'm not really going to drag his name that could be potentially completely innocent, because I'm sure that it's been hard enough for him as it is. That is, if he is innocent, of course. But until the investigators release more information, the case of Michael Gaine is unlikely to leave the minds of people of Kerry. You know, for now, it really stands as one of the creepiest, most unsettling Irish mysteries of 2025. A case that haunts because it offers no clear ending. As always, let me know which stories surprised you the most, and also your thoughts on what could have happened. Until next time.